On Christmas Eve, 1884, a starving Boston girl with 3 pennies in her fist walked into a Wyoming general store and begged for a sack of cornmeal. The shopkeeper laughed in her face. The whole town laughed with him. Then the laughter died, because behind her, rising out of the shadows like a mountain rising out of the timber line, stood a man in a bear fur coat who had not set foot in that town in 5 years. And what he did next would change every day of her life that remained. This is the story of how Adelaide Whitcomb became Mrs. Jasper Thorne. The bell above the door of Hiram Gable's general store rang out clear and bright on the night of December 24th, 1884. It was a cheerful sound, a holiday sound, the kind of sound that should have meant warmth and welcome and the soft glow of lanterns reflecting off polished glass jars filled with peppermint sticks and dried apricots. But the woman who stepped through that doorway carried no cheer with her. She carried only the snow on her thin shoulders and 3 copper pennies clutched so tightly in her gloveless fist that the metal had gone warm against her skin. Her name was Adelaide Whitcomb, though no one in Pine Ridge, Wyoming territory had bothered to learn it. They called her the Boston girl. They called her Hartley's woman, even though Hartley had never been her husband and never would be. Some called her worse things behind their hands when she walked past on the wooden boardwalks with newspaper stuffed into her 2 large men's boots to keep out the cold. She was 23 years old. She had not eaten a full meal in 4 days, and tonight, on the holiest night of the year, she had come to beg. What she did not yet understand was that the next hour would change every day of her life that remained. Hidden from her was the truth that the man standing in the shadow at the back of the store, the man whose massive shoulders rose above the row of flour sacks like a mountain rising above the timber line, was already watching her. Hidden from her was the truth that her uncle Cornelius Whitcomb in Boston had read the Morning Globe 3 weeks ago and was already buying his train ticket west. All she knew was that she was hungry, and the snow outside was falling harder. The store smelled like every good thing the world had to offer: roasted coffee beans and sweet pipe tobacco, cinnamon sticks tied with red ribbon, the leather of new harness, and the bright tin shine of dippers and basins hanging from the rafters. Della closed her eyes for one short breath and let the warmth touch her cheeks, and she thought of her father's parsonage in Boston when she was a child, the year her mother was still alive, and the windows steamed up from a goose roasting in the oven, and the choir from the church came caroling at the door. She thought of her mother's hand on her shoulder, the pressure of it, the certainty. Then she opened her eyes, and the choir was gone, and her mother was gone, and her father was gone, and she was here in a frontier town 1,500 miles from any soul who had ever loved her, asking a man named Hiram Gable for credit on a sack of cornmeal. Hiram Gable saw her come in. He was a heavy man with a face like a boiled ham and a starched white apron tied around his middle. He was weighing out 2 pounds of white sugar for the mayor's wife, Mrs. Calloway, who wore a velvet bonnet trimmed with peacock feathers and stood with her gloved hands folded primly in front of her. Gable peered at Della over the top of his wire spectacles. He did not smile. He did not nod. He took his time finishing the weighing, tied the paper sack with twine, slid it across the counter to Mrs. Calloway, accepted her coins, and only then did he turn his attention to the pale girl in the navy blue dress who was waiting at the end of the line. The store was full. 3 men stood by the iron stove warming their gloved hands and trading stories about a wolf seen near the Caulfield Ranch. 2 women in fine wool coats fingered bolts of calico cloth by the dry goods shelf. The Whitfield boy, who was 14 and freckled and mean, leaned against a barrel of pickles eating a sugar candy he had not paid for. The bell on the door had stopped ringing. The conversation, slowly like ice cracking on a pond, began to die down. Heads turned, eyes traveled across the room and settled on Adelaide Whitcomb. She kept her chin lifted. Her father had taught her that when she was very small. A Whitcomb does not lower her head, he had said. A Whitcomb meets the world full in the face, even when the world meets her cruelly. He had said this to her on the day they buried her mother. She had been 5 years old. She had remembered it ever since. She walked to the counter. Her 2 big boots made a wet sound on the sawdust floor. The newspaper inside them had begun to tear from the soaking it took on her long walk through the snowdrifts from Pete Sutter's barn at the edge of town. She could feel the pebbles of the boardwalk through what was left of the soles. She did not look at the people in the store. She looked only at Hiram Gable. "Mr. Gable," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she had meant it to. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Gable, sir." He raised one heavy eyebrow. "Miss Whitcomb," he said in a tone that was loud enough for the whole store to hear. "You are letting the cold in. Either purchase something or take your leave." She stepped closer to the counter. She leaned in. She tried to keep her voice low enough that maybe Mrs. Calloway would not hear, low enough that maybe the Whitfield boy would not hear and would not run home to tell his mother and have it spread across all of Pine Ridge by morning. She tried to keep some small piece of her dignity intact. "Sir," she whispered, "I have come to ask for credit. Just a small bag of cornmeal, maybe a few dried beans. I will pay you back when the spring comes. I am looking for work. I have been looking for work. Mr. Sutter, the blacksmith, will vouch for me. I am asking only for tonight." She watched Hiram Gable's face. She watched it the way a starving dog watches a stranger's hand, hoping for kindness, expecting the boot. She had practiced this speech on the long walk down the mountain road. She had practiced it in the doorway of Pete Sutter's barn, while Pete coughed and shivered under his thin blanket and could not look at her. She had told herself all the way down that surely a man would not turn away a starving girl on Christmas Eve. Surely there was that much mercy left in the world. But Hiram Gable did not whisper. He boomed. "Credit," he said, and his voice rolled out across the store like a barrel down a hill. "Credit Miss Whitcomb. On Christmas Eve." He laughed. It was a barking, ugly laugh, and it filled the room. "Your fellow Hartley promised me credit too," he said. 3 months back he sat right where you are standing now, and he promised me credit, and then he ran off to Cheyenne with a saloon girl and a bag of my own coffee beans. Now you come in here in his rags asking the same. Tell me, Miss Whitcomb, do I look like a man who learns slow?" The Whitfield boy giggled. One of the men by the stove chuckled into his beard. Mrs. Calloway, who had paused at the door to adjust her gloves, turned her face away and smiled into her collar. Della felt the heat climb up her throat and into her cheeks. She felt her eyes begin to burn. She lowered her voice further still. "Please," she said. "I am not Mr. Hartley. I have never met Mr. Hartley. I came west on his promise. I have nothing. My father was a minister. He taught me to keep my word. I am asking only for a bag of cornmeal. I will sign a paper. I will give you my mother's brooch as security. It is real silver, sir." Her hand went to the cameo at her throat. Her last possession. Her mother had pinned it to her collar the morning of her wedding day, and she had worn it every Sunday for 20 years, and now it sat against the hollow of Della's neck like a small, cold weight against her heart. She began to unpin it. Hiram Gable laughed harder. "Keep your trinket," he said. I have no use for a dead woman's jewelry, and I have no use for a girl who comes begging on Christmas Eve. Tell me, Miss Whitcomb, where is your charity to be? In my pocket. Why not the parson's pocket? Why not Mrs. Calloway's pocket? Why does it always find its way to me? He turned to the room, inviting them in. He spread his thick hands wide. She wants charity, he announced. The Boston girl wants charity. She thinks because it is the night of our Lord, the rules do not apply to her. She thinks I am to feed every stray dog that wanders into Pine Ridge. The store laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of relief, the laugh of people who have been afraid for their own pockets and are glad to find the trouble is not theirs. Mrs. Calloway covered her mouth with her gloved fingers and laughed into them. The men by the stove laughed louder. The Whitfield boy laughed until he choked on his stolen candy. Della stood very still. The small hot point of shame in the center of her chest expanded outward until it filled her, until it pressed against her ribs, until she thought she might be sick on the sawdust floor. The 3 pennies bit into her closed fist. The cameo pin pricked her other palm. Cold air seeped through the gaps in the door behind her. And under all of it, more than anything else, was the simple fact of being alone. More alone than she had been the day her father died. More alone than she had been the day she stepped off the stagecoach in this town and realized no one was coming for her. She turned to leave. Her chin was still up. Her father had taught her that. But the tears had begun, and they would not stop, and she could feel them running hot down her cold cheeks, and she knew that everyone in the store could see them, and that was the final humiliation, the one she had been trying to avoid all month long. She had wept at Pete Sutter's bedside. She had wept in the chuck wagon behind Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house. She had wept into her father's old Bible in the hayloft at night, but she had not wept in front of Pine Ridge, until now. She walked toward the door. She told herself 3 more steps, 3 more steps, and you are out. 3 more steps, and you can fall apart in the snow where no one will see. 2 more steps, 1 more step. And then she walked into a wall. It was not a wall. It was a chest. It was the broadest chest she had ever stood before in her life, and it was covered in dark, oiled bear fur, and it smelled of wood smoke and pine pitch and something colder, something like the high places where men go when they no longer wish to be among other men. She gasped and stumbled back, and a hand the size of a smithing hammer caught her by the elbow and steadied her. She looked up. She had to look up a long way. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, broad as the doorway behind him, and his hair was the color of a chestnut, after the husk has split dark and rich and shot through with sunstreaks where the prairie wind had bleached it. His beard was thick and trimmed close. His face was weathered the color of saddle leather. And his eyes were the color of whiskey in a glass held up to firelight, an amber that should have been warm, but was not an amber that took her in, now the way a hawk takes in a field, gathering everything at once and giving nothing back. He was not looking at her. He was looking past her. His gaze had fixed on Hiram Gable. Behind him 2 more men stepped forward into the lantern light. One was a hand shorter, lighter-haired, with eyes a softer shade of brown, and a stillness about him so complete he might have been carved from the same wood as the door frame. The other, the youngest, was the only one whose mouth softened when his gaze brushed across her, and that small softening was the first kind thing she had seen on a man's face in 3 weeks. 3 brothers, the mountain men, the Thorne brothers, the ones the children of Pine Ridge whispered about behind cupped hands. The ghosts of Wind River. The laughter in the store strangled itself in mid-breath. The Whitfield boy swallowed his candy whole. Mrs. Calloway at the door stopped fussing with her gloves. The men by the stove suddenly remembered urgent business with their boots. Hiram Gable's heavy red face went the color of milk that had begun to turn. The big man, the eldest, did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he spoke, his voice came up out of him like something dragged from the bottom of a well, low and slow and worn smooth by long silences. "Mr. Gable," he said, "I have been standing in your store for 10 minutes. I have heard every word you have said to this lady." Hiram Gable's mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. "Mr. Thorne," he said, and his voice had gone thin, "I did not see you come in." "Most folks do not," Jasper Thorne said. "That is generally how I prefer it." He did not let go of Della's elbow. He did not look at her. He kept his amber eyes fixed on Hiram Gable. The two younger brothers stepped to either side of him, and now the three of them filled the front of the store like a wall, and Hiram Gable was on the wrong side of that wall, and he knew it, and the whole store knew it. Jasper Thorne reached inside his bare fur coat with his free hand. The store held its breath. He drew out a small leather pouch. It was darkened with use. It was the size of a man's clenched fist. He laid it on the counter, gentle as a man laying a baby in a cradle. The sound it made when it touched the wood was not the soft sound of cloth or paper. It was a heavy, dull, certain sound, the sound of gold. "Pay her tab," Jasper said. Hiram Gable blinked. His eyes flicked from the pouch to Della to Jasper. "She does not have a tab, Mr. Thorne. I do not extend her credit." "Then she has one now," Jasper said, "and I am paying it. Cornmeal, beans, sugar, coffee, salt pork, a side of bacon, dried apples if you have them, a wool coat off your rack, the heavy one in the gray, the one that will fit a woman of her size, new boots, new gloves, a scarf, a tin of peppermints, and whatever else the lady would like." He paused and put a Christmas ham in there, the good one, from the smokehouse out back, not the dry one in the front window. Hiram Gable's mouth worked, but no sound came out. His eyes traveled to the pouch on the counter, to the watching faces of his customers, to Mrs. Calloway, whose own eyes had gone wide as saucers above her gloved fingers, to the three Thorne brothers who had not moved. He nodded fast, 3 quick jerks of his thick neck, and he reached for the pouch with hands that had begun to tremble. His fingers fumbled at the drawstring. He spilled a few coins onto the counter. They were heavy yellow coins. They were double eagles, $20 pieces. There were enough of them that the men by the stove watching slowly took off their hats and held them against their chests without quite knowing why. Hiram Gable counted what he needed. He pushed the rest more than half back across the counter toward Jasper. "This is more than the goods, Mr. Thorne. This is far more than the goods." Jasper took in the pile of gold. His attention shifted to Hiram Gable. He spoke very quietly. "The rest is for next time," he said. "The next time a woman walks into your store on Christmas Eve and asks you for a bag of cornmeal. The next time you feel the urge to laugh at her in front of your neighbors. The next time you decide that a person's worth is what is in her purse." He paused. "That is what the rest is for." Hiram Gable's face had gone past white and into a sweating, shaking gray. He nodded. He bent over the counter and began with shaking hands to assemble the order Jasper had named. Jasper turned finally and looked down at Della. His amber eyes had changed. The hawk look was gone. What was left was something deeper, something older, the look of a man gazing on a thing he had lost and then unexpectedly found again. There was sorrow in it. There was a careful, almost reluctant tenderness. And there was a question. She did not know him. She did not know his name beyond the rumor of it. She did not know what he had buried in his life or what he had built to replace it. What she could not yet see was that 10 years ago, on a night just like this one, he had pounded on the door of Dr. Granger's house in this very town with a sick woman dying in his cabin and no gold in his pocket, and the doctor had closed the curtains in his face and let her die. She could not yet see that the laughter she had just walked through had cut him in places that had not yet healed. She could not yet see that he had not set foot in Pine Ridge in 5 years until tonight, and that he had only come tonight because his brother Holden had needed liniment for his back, and that Della Whitcomb, walking into Hiram Gable's store at the moment Jasper Thorne happened to be standing among the flour sacks, was the closest thing to a miracle either of them would ever know. She could not see any of this, but she saw the look in his eyes, and she understood that whatever else was true, this man was not laughing at her. This man had never laughed at her. This man somewhere behind those amber eyes was on her side. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was different now. It was lower. It was for her alone. He glanced at the door. The wind had picked up. The snow was coming sideways now. The bell above the door rattled in the gusts. "It is not safe in town tonight," he said. "The storm is turning bad. There is a cabin up the mountain. It is warm. There is room. My grandmother lives with us. She is a good woman. You would not be alone." He paused. "You can stay until the thaw. There is no obligation in it. None at all." Della stood very still. The tears were drying on her cold cheeks. The heat from the iron stove pressed at her back. And somewhere in the deepest part of her chest, a thing she had not felt in 6 months took shape, and it took her a moment to recognize it. It was the feeling of being seen. Just that. Of being seen by another human being and not turned away. She thought of Pete Sutter sick in his blanket. She thought of the long, dark walk back up to his barn. She thought of her father's Bible in the hayloft. She thought of Cornelius Whitcomb somewhere east looking for her. She thought of all the things she had to lose, and she counted them, and there were none. "I will go," she whispered. Jasper Thorne nodded once. He shrugged off the great bear fur coat from his own shoulders and settled it over hers, and the weight of it nearly drove her to her knees, and the warmth of it was so immediate and so absolute that she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from weeping again. The youngest brother, Caleb, stepped forward and took her small carpet bag from where she had set it by the door. The middle brother, Holden, opened the door against the wind, his rifle held across his chest in a way that suggested he had used it before and would not hesitate to use it again. The wind howled in. The lantern light shuddered. The bell above the door rang once more. Della stepped through. Jasper Thorne stepped through behind her. The door swung shut. The bell stopped ringing. And inside the store a long silence held the room, and no one in Pine Ridge spoke a word for a full 10 seconds. And when Mrs. Calloway finally turned to leave, she did not look at Hiram Gable, and Hiram Gable did not look at anyone, and the Whitfield boy, for the first time in his 14 years, did not laugh. Outside, the world was white and roaring. The snow drove sideways across the boardwalk. A horse hitched at the rail blew steam from its nostrils. The Thorne brothers had brought a sled low and dark with 3 good horses already stamping in their traces blanketed against the cold. Caleb settled her bag in the boot. Holden took up the reins. Jasper lifted Della under her elbows as if she weighed nothing, and he set her on the seat. and he tucked a heavy buffalo robe across her lap, and only when she was wrapped and warm did he climb up beside her. She looked back at Pine Ridge once. The lights in the windows of the houses glowed yellow through the snow. Smoke rose from the chimneys. From the church on the hill, she could just barely hear a few voices beginning the first carol of the night. Silent night. Holy night. The wind tore the words apart before they could reach her. She turned her face forward. The sled lurched and began to move. The runners hissed on the new snow. The harness bells, which Caleb had wrapped in cloth to muffle them, made a low, soft chiming. Pine Ridge fell away behind them. The road climbed. The trees closed in. For a long while no one spoke. The wind did all the talking. Della sat very small under the great coat and the buffalo robe, and she did not know where she was going, and she did not know who these men truly were, and she did not know whether she had just made the wisest choice of her young life or the most foolish. But she knew this. She was warmer than she had been in 3 weeks, and the man beside her, who had not spoken since the door of the store closed behind them, kept glancing down at her every few minutes, as if to make sure she was still there, as if to make sure he had not imagined her. When they had been climbing perhaps an hour, Holden spoke from the driver's seat. His voice was as quiet as his brother's, but lighter, like the voice of a man who chose silence rather than fell into it. "We will be home in another hour, ma'am," he said. "There is hot stew on the fire. Granny Maeve will have heard the bells by now. She will have it ready," Home Della thought. The word landed in her chest like a small bird settling onto a branch. She had not had a home in almost a year. Not since her father's parsonage was sold to pay his medical debts, and she had stepped out of the front door of the only house she had ever known and walked down the steps with one carpet bag in her hand. Home. She let the word stay where it had landed. She did not push it away. Jasper beside her looked down. His amber eyes in the gray stormlight were as warm as a banked fire. "You are home now, Miss Whitcomb," he said, "at least for tonight." She could not answer. Her throat had closed. She only nodded once and turned her face up toward the snow and let the cold flakes settle on her hot cheeks, and she did not weep because she had wept enough for one night, and a Whitcomb does not lower her head, even when the world has been too kind to her too suddenly to bear. 6 months ago, in a parlor in Boston that smelled of old roses and cold ashes, Della had buried her father. He had been a good man. The Reverend Nathaniel Whitcomb had served the same small congregational church on the south side of Boston for 31 years. He had married her mother in 1859. He had buried her mother in 1879. He had raised his only daughter on a minister's salary and the kindness of a small congregation and the books that lined his study from floor to ceiling. He had taught her French and Latin and how to play the upright piano in the parsonage parlor and how to read a Bible in 3 languages and how to be poor with grace. He had taught her, above all, how to keep her head up. He had not taught her how to live without him. The cough had taken him slow. Over a year. Consumption, the doctors called it then. A wasting disease. She had nursed him through that final year while doing the parish work he could no longer do, while writing his sermons in his shaking hand, while reading aloud to him from Tennyson and Longfellow and the Gospel of John. She had been 22 when he died. She had no brothers. Her one brother, Daniel, had died at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 before Della was born. Her mother had never quite recovered from it. The Whitcomb family in Boston, what remained of it, was Della and her father, and the small flat above the church, and 3 rooms full of books. After the funeral, the church paid for itself. The rooms above it did not. The parsonage was sold. The books were sold. The piano was sold. There was a small mortgage on a 5-acre lot in the Boston suburb of Brookline, a lot her father had bought as an investment 10 years before, a lot the family had never built upon. The lot was undeveloped scrub and old oak. It was, the lawyer told her, perhaps worth $400. Hardly enough for a young woman of good family to live on, and certainly not in Boston. She had taken a position as a governess. The Pendleton family on Beacon Hill. 3 children. A salary of $6 a week. It was meant to be temporary. It lasted 3 months. Mrs. Pendleton had a younger brother, a widower, who lived in the household, and his attentions toward the new governess had become impossible to ignore, and Mrs. Pendleton had blamed Della for them, and Della had been dismissed without a reference. It was that same week that her father's cousin, Cornelius Whitcomb, had appeared at her boarding house door. Cornelius was a small, sweating, fox-faced man of 45. She had met him perhaps 4 times in her life. He had not come to her father's funeral. He came now, he said, out of family concern. He had heard she was alone. He had heard she was without prospects. He came to offer her his protection. His protection, it turned out, was a marriage. Not to him, although Della suspected he would have taken that arrangement if she had offered it. To a man named Pinkerton. Mr. Wilbur Pinkerton, 62 years of age, a widower, the owner of 3 hardware stores in Greater Boston. A man, Cornelius assured her, of substantial means, and a man who had taken a particular interest in Della after seeing her at her father's funeral, a funeral Cornelius had not attended, but whose attendees he had apparently catalogued. Della refused. Cornelius pressed. Cornelius produced documents. Documents he claimed gave him guardianship over her because she was a single woman under 25 and her father was deceased. The documents bore what appeared to be the signature of her father, executed 2 years before his death, naming Cornelius Whitcomb as her guardian in the event of his passing. The signature was good. It was nearly perfect. But Della had spent the last year of her father's life signing his correspondence for him because his hands shook too much, and she knew her father's signature better than she knew her own, and the signature on Cornelius's document was wrong. The loop of the W was too round. The dot of the I was too high. It was a forgery. She did not say this to Cornelius. She was clever enough not to. She asked him instead for a week to consider his proposal. He gave it to her, smiling his fox-face smile. 3 days later, she answered an advertisement in the Boston Matrimonial News. Mr. Jeremiah Hartley of Pine Ridge in Wyoming Territory, a man of 35 years, a homestead, a herd of cattle, a need for a wife of good character and steady habits. They corresponded for 4 months. His letters were warm and decently written and signed in a strong hand. He sent her a stagecoach ticket west and money for the train fare from Boston to Cheyenne. She left her boarding house on a Tuesday in early November with 1 carpet bag and her father's Bible and her mother's cameo brooch and the $400 deed to the Brookline lot folded inside the front cover of the Bible. She told no one she was going. She told the boarding house mistress only that she was traveling to family in Connecticut. She had been in Pine Ridge 3 weeks before she understood that Mr. Jeremiah Hartley did not exist, or rather that he existed and had existed, but had not been the man writing the letters. The letters had been written by a confidence man named Hartley, who used 3 different names and had bilked 4 other women in 3 different territories. He had absconded south to the silver camps of New Mexico the week before Della arrived, owing money to half of Pine Ridge. She had no money for the return fare. She had the deed to a $400 lot in Brookline, but she did not know how to convert that to cash from 1,600 miles away, and she did not trust anyone in Pine Ridge enough to ask. She had her mother's brooch, which she would not sell. She had 3 weeks of looking for work in a town that had no work for a Boston governess. She had Pete Sutter's barn and the kindness of Eunice Pemberton at the boarding house and the cold judgment of every other soul in Pine Ridge. And then she had had the night of December 24th, 1884. The night she walked into Hiram Gable's general store. The night she walked into Jasper Thorne. The sled climbed, the trees thickened, the snow fell more steeply now in fat curtains that hissed against the runners. Holden held the horses steady. The road was no road, it was a track. It wound between great Douglas firs with branches that drooped low under the weight of snow. Della had grown up in a city. She had never seen trees this large. She had never seen sky this empty. The whole of Wyoming territory felt to her like the inside of a great white bowl, and she and the Thorne brothers and the horses were the only living things moving in it. After perhaps 2 hours of climbing, Caleb, the youngest brother who had ridden in silence on the rear of the sled, leaned forward and tapped Della's shoulder. "There, ma'am," he said. "Just up the rise. You can see the smoke from here." She squinted into the storm. And there, faint and yellow against the gray-white sky, was a thin column of wood smoke rising from somewhere in the trees ahead. A cabin. A real cabin with a real fire in it, with a real woman waiting beside that fire with hot stew on the stove. Home, Holden had called it. The word landed again in her chest, and this time it stayed. The sled rounded a final bend, and the trees opened, and there, set into the lee of a great gray granite cliff, was the cabin of the Thorne brothers. It was 2 stories. Its walls were logs as thick as a man's chest. Its roof was steep-peaked sharply against the snow. Its windows glowed with lantern light, soft and warm, and the smoke from its single great chimney rose straight up before the storm caught it. A barn stood off to one side. A second, smaller cabin stood beyond the barn, its window also lit. Smoke from its chimney rose too. Jasper Thorne, beside her, regarded the cabin the way other men regard the women they have loved a long time, without comment, without expression, with the quiet certainty of a man who has come home. He turned to her then, and his amber eyes held hers in the stormlight, and he said simply, "This is the place. You are safe here." The cabin door opened. A small, bent figure stood silhouetted in the warm yellow light. A voice called out across the snow, sharp and old and glad. "Boys," the voice cried, "you bring me a Christmas guest after all. Bring her in. Bring her in, the soup is hot." Della felt Jasper's hand under her arm again, steadying her down from the sled. She felt the snow under her feet. She felt the warm, yellow light of the open door across her face. She felt for the first time since her father had died that she had walked into a room where she was expected. She did not yet know what waited for her in the months to come. She did not know that her uncle Cornelius had not given up. What she had not yet been told was that 10 years of grief sat on the man beside her like a stone, and that she would be the one before this winter ended who would help him lift it. Holden carried his own old sorrow, and Caleb his own quiet hopes, and Granny Maeve in the doorway had been praying for the boys to find a good woman for 15 years, and had only that morning told the Lord she was tired of waiting. She knew none of these things. She knew only that she was walking slowly in two big borrowed boots across the new snow toward an open door. She knew the smell of wood smoke and pine. She knew the warmth that reached out toward her. She knew the steadying hand at her elbow, and she knew with the small, certain part of her chest where her father's faith had lived all his life and now lived in her, that she had been led here. By what hand she could not say, but she had been led. Granny Maeve, framed in the lighted doorway, opened her arms. "Welcome, child," she called. Della Whitcomb walked into the cabin of the Thorne brothers on Christmas Eve, 1884, and the door closed behind her against the storm, and the bell at the general store of Hiram Gable, 15 miles down the mountain, was not ringing for her any longer. It would never ring for her again. The door of the cabin closed against the storm, and the world outside fell away. Della stood for a moment in the entryway, snow melting from her hair onto her shoulders, and she let her eyes adjust to the warm orange light. The room she had stepped into was not what she had expected. She had expected a hovel. She had expected the den of 3 men who lived rough and ate rougher. She had expected the smell of unwashed clothes and old grease and animals brought in from the cold. What she found instead was a room that breathed. The ceiling rose 2 full stories above her, crossed with great peeled pine beams that still showed the pale gold of the wood beneath the smoke darkening of the years. A stone fireplace, taller than a man and twice as wide, dominated the far wall, and in it a fire of split aspen and pitchy fir burned hot enough to push the cold of the doorway back across the floor in a steady wave. A long plank table ran the length of the room. Hand-made chairs were drawn up to it, 6 of them mismatched but well-joined. A braided rag rug large enough to cover the center of the floor lay between the table and the hearth. A spinning wheel sat in one corner, dark with use, and along the wall opposite the fireplace, from floor to ceiling, ran shelves of books. Della saw the books first. She always would. There were perhaps 300 of them. Some were leather-bound and cracked at the spines. Some were paper covers, cheap and well-thumbed. She saw in one short sweep a row of Shakespeare in dark green cloth, a Whitman in gray, a complete Dickens that took up most of the 3rd shelf, a King James Bible standing alone on a small reading desk beside the fire, a Milton, a battered set of Plutarch's Lives, a book on grafting fruit trees, a book on the medicinal use of native plants, 2 cracked atlases, and what appeared to be a collected works of Robert Burns. The books in this cabin had been read. They had been read more than once. The spines were soft and broken in the way that only loved books are broken. Della felt her throat tighten. Her father's library, sold off piece by piece in his last year, had looked like this once. The same warm, worn spines, the same smell of leather and dust and ink. She had not known until that moment how much she had missed the smell of books. A small, sharp voice called her back into the room. "Take that wet coat off the child, boys. She is half froze. And someone close that door proper. You are letting in the whole of the storm." Granny Maeve crossed the floor toward her with the quick, steady step of a woman half her age. She stood perhaps 5 feet tall in her boots. Her hair was the color of polished pewter drawn back in a neat, low knot. Her eyes were the same amber as her grandson's, a few shades faded but no less bright, and they took Della in from the soaking hem of her dress to the snow caught in her hair in one short, unhurried look. The verdict came at once. "You will need a hot bath," the old woman said, "and a hot meal, and a warm bed, in that order." Caleb fetched the copper tub from the back room. "Holden, more wood on the fire. Jasper, you stand there like a fence post. Take the lady's coat." Jasper Thorne, who could face down Hiram Gable in a public store without raising his voice, who could carry 100 pounds of dressed elk down a mountain trail in a snowstorm, obeyed his grandmother without a word. He lifted the great bear fur coat from Della's shoulders, careful of her hair, and hung it on a peg by the door. Beneath it, her thin, wet wool dress clung to her shoulders. The cold came into her again. The eyes of the three brothers studiously turned elsewhere all at the same time, and she understood that she was, for the first time in 3 weeks, in a household that intended to treat her as a guest and not as a piece of bad news. Granny Maeve took her by the hand. The old woman's palm was warm and dry, and it closed around Della's frozen fingers with a firmness that brooked no argument. "Come along, child," she said. "Up the stairs. There is a small room above the kitchen with a real bed in it. It was meant to be Caleb's, but Caleb sleeps below in the loft over the wood room, and the bed has been waiting for someone. It will wait no more." Della found to her own surprise that she could not speak. She only nodded. The old woman led her up the narrow plank stairs, and the wood under her feet was so warm from the fire below that she could feel it through the worn soles of her borrowed boots. The room above the kitchen was small and clean and almost startlingly pretty. A single bed stood against the far wall, made up with a quilt of red and blue and yellow squares that someone had stitched by hand a long time ago. A small washstand, a brass candle holder with a fresh tallow candle in it, a wooden chest under the window, and on the wall above the bed, a piece of yellowed embroidery framed in a hoop of bent willow that read in plain stitched letters, "He shall give his angels charge over thee, to keep thee in all thy ways." The handwriting of the stitches was a woman's, a woman who had loved her work. "That was their mother's," Granny Maeve said quietly behind her. "Mary Thorne, my daughter. She made it the year Caleb was born. She is buried up the slope, her and her husband, under the larch that turns yellow in the fall. The boys go up there once a month, all 3 of them, and clear the brush." Della turned. She did not know what to say. The old woman waved one small hand. "Bath first," the old woman said. "Stories later. And no tears, child. Not in this house. In this house we save the tears for funerals and weddings, and there has not been a wedding in too long." The hot bath came in a copper tub set before the kitchen fire. The brothers had withdrawn to the barn, all 3 of them on some unspoken agreement, leaving Della and Granny Maeve and the rising steam alone. The old woman scrubbed Della's back with rough lye soap, the way a grandmother scrubs a small child, and she clucked over the thinness of Della's shoulder blades, and she put more wood on the fire when Della began to shiver. And at last she wrapped Della in a thick wool nightdress that had belonged to Mary Thorne, and was a little too long in the sleeves, and smelled very faintly of cedar and lavender. "Bed now," the old woman said. "The stew will keep. The boys can eat without you. You will eat tomorrow." Della tried to protest. Her last meal had been a hard biscuit at noon 2 days ago, but the old woman would not be argued with, and the bed beneath the quilt was warmer than any bed Della had slept in since her father's parsonage, and her body had begun to shake with a deep tiredness that ran down to the marrow of her bones. She lay down. She closed her eyes for one moment. The candle on the washstand guttered once. She did not wake until morning. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and to the sound somewhere below her of an axe striking wood with a steady, measured rhythm. She lay for a long while in the unfamiliar bed, looking up at the pine boards of the ceiling, listening. Somewhere a door opened and closed. Somewhere a low voice spoke, and another low voice answered. The axe continued. Outside her small window, the storm had passed in the night, and the sky over the mountain was a hard, clean blue, and the snow on the great firs was so white it hurt her eyes to look at it. She was warm. She was clean. She was in a bed. For a long moment she could not place where she was, and then she remembered. Hiram Gable's laugh, the bell on the door, the wall of bear fur, the amber eyes. You are home now. Della rose. She dressed in her own dress, dried and brushed clean by Granny Maeve in the night, and she pinned the cameo at her throat, and she went down the narrow stairs. Caleb was the only one in the cabin. He was standing at the long table, a paring knife in his hand, peeling potatoes into a wooden bowl. He looked up when she came down. His amber eyes, brighter than his eldest brother's, crinkled at the corners. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Coffee is on." Granny stepped down to the milk shed. "Holden is out with the traps. Jasper is at the wood pile." He nodded toward the window. Della looked. Through the wavy glass, she could see in the bright, cold morning Jasper Thorne at the woodpile. He had stripped off his great fur coat and hung it on a fence post. He worked in his shirt sleeves and a leather vest, and the steam of his breath rose around him in soft clouds. He swung the splitting axe in a long, economical arc, and the rounds of pine split open with a clean, sharp sound that carried across the yard. He was not hurrying. He was working at the steady, measured pace of a man who knows he has the whole day and the whole season and the whole rest of his life to do this same work, and he does not need to rush. Della stood at the window for longer than she intended. Caleb cleared his throat behind her gently, the way a younger brother clears his throat to spare his elder. "He cuts about a cord a day in winter," Caleb said. "Has done for 10 years. Says it keeps a man honest." Della turned. She felt the heat in her cheeks. Caleb had the grace not to smile. "There is biscuits in the warming oven, ma'am, and bacon on the back of the stove. Granny said you was to eat as much as you could hold, and then eat a little more on top of that." She ate. She ate more than she had eaten in a single meal in 4 months. Caleb went on peeling potatoes and made no remark on her appetite, and at some point Granny Maeve came in from the milk shed with a steaming pail and clucked once approvingly at the empty plate and refilled it without asking. The day went on like that. The first day, the second, the third. Della did not know in those first days what she was supposed to be. The brothers had said only that she could stay until the thaw. She had been a guest in fine Boston houses before as a governess, and she knew the way of being a guest. But she was not a guest here. A guest does not feel the slow, soft pressure to be useful. A guest does not catch herself on the second morning washing dishes in the basin without being asked. A guest does not on the third afternoon take a needle and thread to a tear in Caleb's shirt sleeve while he is out at the barn, and leave the mended shirt folded on his chair without a word, and feel when she sees him put it on the next morning, and run his hand down the seam in quiet surprise, a small private gladness she has not felt since her father was alive. She was not a guest. She did not know yet what she was, but she was learning hour by hour the shape of the household she had walked into. She learned that Jasper rose first, always an hour before dawn, and built up the fire and ground the coffee. She learned that Holden, who hardly spoke, was the one who knew where every tool in the cabin was kept and who repaired anything that broke before anyone else noticed it had been broken. She learned that Caleb sang under his breath when he worked old hymns and older Scots ballads their mother had taught them, and that he stopped singing when he saw he was being listened to, but his ears went a little pink, and the next time he started up again, he would sing a touch louder, as if not minding being heard at all. She learned the rhythm of the meals. Breakfast was at first light, dinner at noon, supper at full dark. The brothers came in from their work with the cold still on their coats, and they hung the coats on the pegs by the door, and they washed at the basin, and they sat at the long table, and they bowed their heads, and Jasper, as the eldest, said the same short grace each time. Lord, for what we are about to receive, make us truly thankful and bless the hands that have prepared it, and the people who have not. Amen. Della on the second morning realized that the last clause was new, the hands that have prepared it and the people who have not. He had not said that on the first morning. On the first morning the grace had ended at thankful. He had added the second part for her, for the hands of Della Whitcomb, who had set the plates that morning. She did not raise her head. She did not let him see that she had heard. But that night she could not sleep for a long time, and she lay looking at her mother's cameo on the small wooden chest under the window, and she thought, this man notices. This man notices everything. By the end of the first week, the Thorne brothers had begun each in his own way to teach her. It was Caleb who came to her first. On the fourth morning, while Jasper was out checking a fence line and Holden was at the traps, Caleb stood at the table sharpening the kitchen knives on a small whetstone, and he glanced up at her where she stood at the basin, and he said, easy and offhand, "Ma'am, can you skin a rabbit?" Della turned. She had been a governess in Boston. She had taught 5-year-old children to write the letter G. She had played Chopin nocturnes for the Pendletons at Christmas. She had never in her whole 23 years on this earth skinned a rabbit. "I cannot, Mr. Thorne," she said. "Caleb, ma'am," he said. "Just Caleb. Holden snared 2 this morning. They are hanging in the smokehouse. I will show you if you like. There is no shame in not knowing. There is only shame in pretending." So Della Whitcomb of Boston, in her navy blue dress with the small lace collar, stood beside Caleb Thorne at the cold stone table behind the smokehouse, and she watched him slit the hide of a winter rabbit cleanly along the belly, and she watched him peel it back, the way a man peels back the wrapper from a candy, and she watched him gut it and quarter it, and lay the meat on the salt board. He did not laugh at her when she had to look away. He did not press her when she went pale. He simply talked in his quiet voice about how their mother had taught him this same task at age 6, and how their mother had told him that a rabbit dressed with respect feeds a body twice, once with its meat and once with its memory. By the second rabbit, Della was watching. By the third, she was holding the hide for him while he cut. By the end of that week, she could dress a rabbit alone slowly but well, and Caleb had given her her own paring knife, a small one with a deer antler handle, and he had said, "This is yours now, ma'am. I made the handle when I was 17. The blade is good. It will last you." She kept it in her apron pocket from that day. It was Holden who taught her next. Holden, who hardly spoke at all, came in from the barn on the second Sunday morning with a small canvas case in his hand, and he laid it on the table without comment and opened it. Inside, in tidy clips, were a row of brass snare wires of different gauges. He looked up at her. His brown eyes were soft. They reminded her of a deer in deep timber watching from a long way off. "Ma'am," he said, "if you have an hour, I will show you the snare lines." She put on her new wool coat, the heavy gray one Jasper had bought her at Hiram Gable's store, and her new boots, the ones that fit, and she went with Holden up a narrow track behind the cabin into a stand of young aspens. He showed her how to find the rabbit runs in the snow, the small, shallow grooves where the animals passed in the night. He showed her how to set the snare so that the loop hung at the height of a rabbit's head, and how to anchor the wire to a sapling that would whip up and break the animal's neck cleanly when it ran. He made her set 3 snares herself slowly while he watched. He nodded once when she had done it right. That single nod from Holden Thorne, she would understand later, was as effusive a praise as the man was capable of offering. "You did good, ma'am," he said when they walked back. "Most folk take a season to learn that. You learned it in an hour." "I had a good teacher," she said. He did not answer that. But the next morning, before first light, Holden left a small wrapped parcel on the chair where Della usually sat at breakfast. Inside the cloth was a pair of fur-lined leather gloves, sized for a woman's hand, oiled soft. They had been Mary Thorne's. They smelled faintly of the cedar chest at the foot of Granny Maeve's bed. There was no note. Holden did not look at her at breakfast. He never mentioned the gloves. But Della wore them every day from that morning onward, and her hands did not crack again that winter. Jasper was the last to teach her. Or perhaps he was the first. She was never quite sure. It happened on the 9th night. The brothers were at the table after supper. Holden was oiling a trap. Caleb was carving slowly at a small block of pine that he was turning into a wooden spoon. Granny Maeve was knitting. Della was sitting in the low chair by the fire with her feet tucked under her, and she had not spoken in some time because she had been watching Jasper. He sat across the room with a book open on his knees. His amber eyes moved slowly down the page. His lips moved very faintly with the words. He had been reading for an hour. Della had been pretending to read herself, but she had been watching him over the top of her book for most of that time, and her own page had not turned in 20 minutes. He looked up. He caught her eye. She flushed. She looked down quickly. He closed his own book over one finger to hold his place. He said mildly, "What are you reading, Miss Whitcomb, Wuthering Heights?" she said. "From your shelf. I hope that is all right." "It is more than all right," he said. "That book has been waiting. None of us has the stomach for the moors. We are mountain folk." She smiled. She could not help it. He smiled back. It was the first time she had seen Jasper Thorne smile fully, and the change in his face was so complete that she had to look down at her book again to keep from staring. The amber eyes had warmed. The hard line of his mouth had softened. For a moment, he looked not like the wall of bear fur in Hiram Gable's store, but like a young man, perhaps 20, who might once have laughed easily. He came across the room. He pulled up the chair beside her. He sat down slowly as if he were aware he was a large man approaching a smaller one and did not wish to crowd her. "You read aloud well," he said. "I heard you read to Granny last night, from the Burns book. I did not know anyone was listening. We were all listening." She did not know what to say to that. She turned a page she had not read. He watched the fire for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Our mother used to read aloud at night. The 4 of us would sit on the rug in front of this fire. Mary Thorne read everything. Shakespeare, Burns, the Book of Job. She had a voice for each character. We learned how to read because she made the words sound like something worth knowing." "How old was Caleb?" Della asked carefully when she died. 12, Jasper said. "Holden was 16. I was 28. Father had been gone 6 years by then. He died of pneumonia in the winter of '72. Mother held the place together 6 years on her own with Granny's help. She died of a fever in the spring of '78. After that, it was the three of us and Granny. Della was quiet. It was a long time ago, he said. He watched the fire for some time. She thought he might say more. He did not. After a while, he shifted in his chair. His attention moved to her hands in her lap, to the cameo at her throat, back to the fire. "I have been meaning to thank you," he said. "For what?" "For the shirt cuff you mended on Caleb's shirt." He noticed. We all noticed. He has worn that shirt every day since. He thinks we do not see, but we see. He has not had a woman mend for him since he was 12 years old. Della felt the heat rise in her cheeks again. She kept her eyes on the page. "It was a small thing," she said. "It was not a small thing," Jasper said. Then he stood. He carried his book back across the room. He set it on the shelf. He said goodnight to his brothers and to his grandmother. He went out to the barn where he slept in the small bunk room above the stalls, because Granny Maeve had insisted from the first night that Della was to have his upstairs room, and there was no point in arguing, and because Jasper Thorne, Della had begun to understand, was a man who slept poorly indoors anyway. She sat by the fire a long time after he had gone. The days began to settle into a rhythm she had not known she was missing. She rose at first light. She took down the coffee Jasper had ground. She mixed biscuit dough by Granny Maeve's recipe and set the iron Dutch oven on the bed of coals at the front of the hearth. She fried bacon and saved the grease in the tin can on the back of the stove. She fed the chickens in the small lean-to behind the barn, the chickens that survived the winter on a diet of cracked corn and table scraps, and the occasional handful of dried meal worms Caleb kept for them in a stoppered jar. She learned to milk the brown cow slowly, badly at first, and then less badly, and finally, well, and by the end of the second week, she could fill the bucket without tipping it. She read in the afternoons. She read everything on the shelf, and then she began to read it again. She read aloud to Granny Maeve while the old woman knit by the fire, and Granny Maeve's eyes drifted closed sometimes, and her knitting did not. She read aloud sometimes when the brothers were in the cabin too, and they did not say anything, and they did not look up, but Caleb's carving slowed when she read, and Holden's hands paused on his trap oiling, and Jasper across the room kept his book open on his knees, but did not turn its pages. She knew. She did not say so. She walked the snare line with Holden every other morning. She learned to tell the track of a snowshoe hare from the track of a fox. She learned to tell pine marten from mink, from weasel, by the shape of the print and the depth of the stride. She learned from Caleb the names of the trees on the slope behind the cabin. Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, lodgepole pine, white bark pine, the highest tree on the mountain, the one that grew where nothing else would grow. She learned from Jasper on a single bright cold afternoon to load and fire a rifle, and her first shot went so wide of the target that Caleb laughed out loud, and Holden laughed silently with his shoulders shaking, but her 10th shot punched a hole 1 inch from center, and Jasper said, "Only, you have a steady hand." Miss Whitcomb and Della did not stop smiling for the rest of the afternoon. "You are home now," she heard Granny Maeve say to her one evening, as the old woman tucked a shawl over her shoulders by the fire. "Right where you are supposed to be." Della did not answer. She did not need to. The change came on the 14th night. Granny Maeve had been a little quiet at supper. She had eaten only half her bowl of stew, and she had complained lightly of a chill in her bones. By bedtime, she was coughing. By midnight, she was burning hot. By the small hours of the morning, she was raving softly under her breath in a language Della did not understand at first, until Della realized it was Gaelic, the old language of the woman's childhood in the Highlands of Scotland, before she came across the ocean to a frontier she had not been born for. Della did not panic. She had nursed her father through a year of consumption. She knew the look of a sick old woman in the night. She built up the fire. She set water boiling. She found in the cabinet by the hearth a tin of dried willow bark, which her own mother had taught her was nature's aspirin. She steeped it strong. She mixed in a spoon of honey from the small crock on the high shelf. She propped Granny Maeve up in her bed and got the tea into her sip by patient sip. Caleb stood in the doorway, white as the snow outside his hands, twisting in his apron. Caleb, who could skin a rabbit and dress an elk and split firewood by the cord, did not know what to do with a sick old woman in a bed. Della looked up at him. "Caleb," she said, calm and firm, "I need a kettle of hot water. I need clean cloths. I need the mustard powder if you have any, and dry linen, and I need you to find Holden and ride for whatever bark of pine you can strip from a young sapling, the inner bark, the green part. Go now." He went. He went without a word, and he went fast, and he ran the half-mile to where Holden had a snare line set in the dark with only the moon for light, and he and Holden were back in 20 minutes with strips of green pine bark steaming in a tin pail. Jasper had been on the high pasture checking on the cattle. He came in at 4 in the morning. He saw the lit window. He came up the stairs at a run. He stopped in the doorway of his grandmother's room. He saw Della Whitcomb sitting at his grandmother's bedside in the lamplight, her hair down loose around her shoulders, a bowl of cooling water in her lap, a folded cloth in her hand. He saw his grandmother breathing slow and easy asleep. Her fever broke in a faint sheen of healthy sweat on her temples. He saw Caleb dozing in the corner chair. He saw Holden standing at the window with a mug of coffee. He stood in the doorway a long time. Della, sensing him there, looked up. His amber eyes in the lamplight were not a hawk's eyes. They were not the eyes of the man at Hiram Gable's store. They were the eyes of a man gazing on something he had thought lost long ago, and the look in them was so naked and so unguarded that Della's hand with the cloth in it stopped above the basin. She could not move. He did not speak for some time. When he did, his voice was rough. "My mother," he said, "Mary Thorne. She did this for our father. The same, the willow bark, the mustard, the cloth on the brow. I watched her do it. I was 22 years old. He died anyway. But she did this. You did the same for our family tonight, Miss Whitcomb." Della could not answer. Her throat had closed. Jasper crossed the room. He knelt down beside her chair. He was so tall that even kneeling he was nearly her height. He took the cloth from her hand gently, and he set it on the rim of the basin. He took her hand in both of his own. His hands were enormous. They were rough as bark. They were warm. He did not say anything more. He only held her hand in the lamplight with his grandmother breathing steady in the bed and his brothers watching from across the room, and the years of cold she had been carrying in her chest began very slowly to thaw. After a long while, he let go. He stood. He put one large hand on her shoulder briefly, and he went down the stairs to make coffee for the morning that was already beginning to come. Della sat very still by the bed. Outside, somewhere in the dark, an owl called once across the great snow-silent valley. The fire on the hearth below cracked and settled. Granny Maeve breathed in. Granny Maeve breathed out. 2 nights later, Della could not sleep. She had been replaying that moment, the moment of his hand on hers, the moment of the look in his eyes for 2 days. She rose from her bed. She wrapped herself in Mary Thorne's old wool nightdress and a shawl over that, and she crept down the stairs to fetch a cup of water from the bucket by the door. Jasper was sitting at the long plank table. He had a single tallow candle lit. The fire had burned low to embers. He was not reading. He had a small object in his hands, and he was turning it over slowly between his fingers. When he heard her on the bottom step, he looked up. He did not move to hide what he held. It was a small tintype photograph in a brass frame. He had been weeping. Not now, but recently. The track of one tear had dried on the side of his nose into the ruff of his beard. His amber eyes were swollen at the corners. Della stopped. She did not know whether to go on or go back. "Come sit, Miss Whitcomb," he said quietly, "if you can stand to." She came. She sat across the table from him. He pushed the tintype toward her. She did not pick it up. She only looked. The photograph was of a young woman, perhaps 20, in a dark dress with a high lace collar. Her hair was plaited at the side of her head. Her eyes, even in the small gray-brown of the tintype, were direct and steady. Her name was Eleanor Ashcroft, Jasper said. We were to be married in the spring of 1874. I was 24 years old. She was 20. He turned the tintype over in his hand. He laid it flat on the table. He did not look at it again. She took sick that February. The fever. We did not know what kind. I rode through a storm to fetch Dr. Granger in the town. I had no money in my pocket. I had nothing but my word that I would pay. He looked through his window at me. I stood on his porch in the snow for an hour. He never opened the door. He never even drew the curtain back enough to let me see his face. I rode home empty-handed. Eleanor died in my arms before sunup. Della's hand had gone to her mouth. She did not realize it. Her father blamed me. Jasper went on in the same level voice, as if the words had been waiting in him a long time and were tired now. Mr. Ashcroft, he was a hard man. He said I had taken her up the mountain and not gotten her to the doctor in time. He had me run out of Pine Ridge. I did not fight him. I had no fight left in me. I came up here to this cabin. My brothers were young still. Caleb was 8. Holden was 12. They came with me. We have been on this mountain, the 3 of us, ever since. He paused. I swore on her grave I would never again put my faith in the kindness of any soul down in that town. I swore it for 10 years, Miss Whitcomb. I have kept it for 10 years. He looked up at her at last. And then, on Christmas Eve, I rode down to fetch Holden some liniment for his back. And I stood in the back of Hiram Gable's store. And I heard a man laugh at a woman who was asking for a sack of cornmeal. And I saw her face when he laughed. He stopped. He breathed in. He breathed out. I have spent 10 years, he said, telling myself I could not have saved Eleanor. Even now I do not know if it is true, but I knew standing in that store that I could save the woman in front of me, and that if I did not, I would never again be able to look at Eleanor's photograph without shame. His gaze fell back to the tintype on the table. That is why I came across the floor, Miss Whitcomb. That is why I paid your tab. That is why I brought you here. I did not bring you out of pity. I brought you because I could not bear to watch the world close another curtain on a good woman in front of me. Della had not realized she was weeping until she felt the tear slide down to the corner of her mouth. She reached across the table. She laid her small hand over his work-hardened one. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. Jasper Thorne did not pull his hand away. He turned it slowly, palm up, beneath hers. He closed his fingers very lightly around hers. He held her hand for perhaps 5 seconds. He let go. He stood. He picked up the tintype. He carried it back to a small drawer in the corner cupboard where Della understood now he kept it. He closed the drawer. His eyes returned to her once across the room. "Good night, Miss Whitcomb," he said. His voice had thickened. "Good night, Mr. Thorne," she said. He went out the front door of the cabin. She heard the door of the barn open and close. She sat at the long table with the candle guttering between her hands. She did not weep again that night. She felt something else, something deeper than weeping. A knot somewhere in the center of her chest, a knot that had been there for months, perhaps for years. Perhaps, since the morning her father had died, began very slowly to come undone. The next morning, Caleb came back from a run down to Pine Ridge. He had gone for salt and a roll of nails for a fence repair. He carried, when he came in through the door at midday, a brown paper packet in his hand, and his face was the color of a snowdrift in the sun, white and hard and afraid. He laid the packet on the table. "Jasper," he said. Jasper, who had been at the hearth, turned. "There is a man in town," Caleb said. "He came in on yesterday's stage from Cheyenne. He is asking for a young woman from Boston, by name, by Della's name. He is staying at Mrs. Pemberton's." He paused. "He says he is her uncle." The room went very still. "He has hired 2 men," Caleb said. "They wear sidearms. They are not from Wyoming. He is offering $500 for any information about her whereabouts." Della felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Cornelius," she whispered. "He has come." Jasper Thorne by the hearth did not move. His amber eyes had gone hard and bright. He looked at Della, and the look in his eyes was no longer the look of the man who had wept at the table the night before. It was the look of the man at Hiram Gable's store, the hawk look, the look of a man who has decided. "Miss Whitcomb," he said very quietly, "come away from the window." Outside, far down the valley in the cold, bright noon, a dark figure on horseback had appeared at the foot of the mountain track, and behind him 2 more. They were already climbing. The figures on the trail below were small at that distance, no larger than 3 black pebbles, moving slowly across a great white tablecloth. But the cold mountain air carried the truth of them up the slope, and Della Whitcomb knew before Jasper said another word that the past she had run from was no longer behind her. It was climbing the mountain to find her. Jasper turned from the window slowly. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He looked at Holden, and Holden was already moving toward the rifle rack on the far wall. He looked at Caleb, and Caleb was already pulling on his coat. "Holden," he said, "take the long route around the high meadow. Come down behind them on the switchback. Do not show yourself. Do not fire unless I do." "Caleb." "The barn loft. The window above the door faces the path. You will see them before they see you." Same instructions. Both younger brothers moved without question. Holden took down the long Sharps rifle and a box of paper cartridges. Caleb took the short shotgun and a handful of buckshot shells. Neither man looked at the other. They had done some version of this before Della understood. Perhaps not against men. Perhaps against wolves, or a bear in the spring, or a mountain lion at a calving pen. But the choreography of 3 brothers preparing for danger was old in this cabin and worn smooth as the handle of an axe. Jasper turned to Della. His amber eyes were not hard now. They were steady. They were the eyes of a man who had been preparing for this exact morning in some quiet corner of himself since the night he carried her out of Hiram Gable's store. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "I will not let him take you. You have my word on that. But I need you to listen to me very carefully." She nodded. She could not yet trust her voice. He took her by the shoulders. His hands were gentle, but the weight of them was the weight of a promise. "You are not going to hide," he said. "I will not put you in a closet. I will not lie about you. A man who lies about his woman has already lost her. You will sit at this table when he comes to the door. You will be calm. You will be polite. You will let me speak first. You will not raise your voice, and you will not run, and you will not give him one single piece of you that he has not earned the right to. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said. His gaze held hers a long moment. "Tell me about him," he said. "Tell me everything. Every word he ever wrote you, every dollar he ever wanted, every paper he ever showed you with your father's name on it. I need to know the man before he gets here. I need to know what he is afraid of." Della sat down at the long table. Granny Maeve, who had risen from her sickbed only that morning, came down the stairs slowly with a quilt around her shoulders, and she sat down across from Della without a word, and she put her two thin old hands flat on the table and waited. Jasper sat at the head of the table. He did not write anything down. He never did, Della told him. She told him everything. She told him about the day Cornelius had appeared at her boarding house door 3 weeks after her father's funeral. She told him about the proposed marriage to Wilbur Pinkerton. She told him about the document Cornelius had produced with what looked like her father's signature, and about the wrongness of the loop on the W and the height of the dot on the I. She told him about the $400 lot in Brookline, the lot that had been her father's small inheritance from his own father, the lot that everyone had thought was worth $400, but that the railroad survey posted in the Boston Globe just before Della had left the city had put on the proposed Boston and Albany spur line. She told him she did not know what the lot was worth now. It might be worth $1,000. It might be worth $10,000. Cornelius would know. Cornelius had clearly known for some time. That was why he had come for her in the first place. That was why he had crossed half a continent in winter to find her. Jasper listened. He did not interrupt. He did not nod or shake his head. He was so still that Della began to feel somewhere in the middle of her telling that she was not speaking to a man at all, but to a deep, cold pool of water that received everything she dropped into it and gave nothing back. When she had finished, he sat for perhaps a full minute in silence. Then he said very quietly, "Your father was a minister." "Yes." "His name appears on the deed to that Brookline lot." "Yes." "Then it appears on the probate filing in Boston when he died." "Yes." "And the probate filing names you his only child as sole heir." "Yes." "The lawyer who handled it was Mr. Edmund Ashby on Court Street." Jasper turned to Granny Maeve. Granny Maeve turned back. "He has no claim," the old woman said simply. "He has no claim," Jasper agreed. "He has a forged guardianship paper and 3 weeks of lies and 2 paid gunmen who do not know they are working for a thief." His attention returned to Della. "We are not going to fight this man with bullets, Miss Whitcomb, if we can help it. He is going to fight us with a piece of paper, and we are going to beat him with a better piece of paper. But I need you to know something. He has come a long way for what he wants. A man does not come this far in winter unless he believes the prize is worth dying for. So I will tell you plain. If it comes to bullets, My brothers and I will not be the ones who fall." She believed him. A small clock on the mantel ticked and ticked and ticked. Outside, the wind had begun to rise again. Snow flurries spun across the yard. Smoke from the kitchen chimney was being torn sideways. Holden was already gone. Caleb was already in the barn loft. Della had not seen them go. Jasper rose. He took down his own rifle from the rack. He did not load it where Della could see. He simply held it across his arm. He took up his bare fur coat. He went to the door. He opened it. The cold came pouring in. He turned back once. "Stay at the table, Miss Whitcomb. Whatever happens, stay at this table." He stepped out. The door closed behind him. Della and Granny Maeve sat at the long plank table in the warm cabin with the wind beginning to scream around the eaves and the fire on the hearth burning low, and neither of them spoke for some time. The old woman reached across the table and took Della's hand. Her grip was thin and dry and surprisingly strong. "Child," she said, "I have lived 83 years on this earth. I came across an ocean when I was 12. I have buried a husband and a daughter and a son-in-law. I have seen good men ride away in the morning and not come back at night. I want to tell you something I should have told you sooner." "Yes, that boy out there," Granny Maeve said, "my grandson. 10 years he has lived in this cabin like a man holding his breath. 10 years. And you came up that mountain on Christmas Eve, and he started breathing again. I saw it the moment he walked through that door behind you. I have not seen him breathe since Eleanor was alive." "Granny, hush, child. I am speaking now. He will not say it to you for some time yet. He is a careful man. He has been hurt once, and he will not run blind into a second hurt. But you mark what I am telling you. He is breathing again because of you. Whatever happens out there in the next hour, whatever a man with a paper says to your face, you remember that. You hear me. I hear you. Then we will sit here and we will wait," said Granny Maeve, and she did not let go of Della's hand. The riders came up the last bend of the trail 40 minutes later. Della heard the horses first. She heard the muffled pad of hooves in deep snow and the creak of saddle leather and the soft jingle of bit chains. She did not move. She did not look out the window. She sat at the table with her hands folded in front of her, the way her mother had taught her to sit at supper as a small girl, with the cameo at her throat and her hair pinned up neat and her chin lifted. A voice she had not heard in 7 months called out from the yard. "Hello, the cabin. I am looking for my niece Adelaide Whitcomb. I have business with her." Della closed her eyes for one moment. The voice, the fox-face voice. It had not changed. Outside, Jasper Thorne's voice came back level and unhurried. "There is no Adelaide Whitcomb at this cabin who answers to the name of niece, sir. State your name and your business." A pause. "My name is Cornelius Whitcomb. I am the legal guardian of one Adelaide Whitcomb who is in your custody. I have papers to that effect. I have the law of the territory of Wyoming behind me. I have come to take her home." "Step down off your horse," Mr. Whitcomb said, Jasper. "Your 2 friends will keep their hands on their saddle horns where I can see them. We will look at your papers in the open. We will not look at them at the point of a gun." Another pause. The creak of saddle leather. The crunch of boots in snow. Della heard Jasper say, "Your friends will hand down their rifles. But first, to the man on the porch behind me, Caleb." Caleb had come down from the loft. He was standing on the porch. There was a third long pause, and then the unmistakable sound of 2 long rifles being passed butt first into other hands. "You may approach the porch now." Mr. Whitcomb, said Jasper, your papers in your hand, your hands away from your coat. Della heard the creak of boots on the porch boards. The cabin door opened. Cornelius Whitcomb stepped through. He was as she remembered him, 45 years old and trying to look 35, small, sweating even in the cold, the same fox face, the same close-set hazel eyes like a clever animal's. He was wearing a black wool town suit badly dusted from the road and a watch chain across his vest. His thin lips spread in the smile. She remembered the smile that always preceded a lie. Behind him came Jasper, and behind Jasper a tall, lean man with sun-colored mustaches and a deputy badge of no town she recognized pinned to his coat, and behind that man a heavier, shorter man with a scarred jaw and the look of the kind of fighter who has been hired before and will be hired again. The two gunmen had both surrendered their long rifles to Caleb on the porch, but they still wore their belt revolvers, and Della saw at once that the leather thongs had been slipped off the hammers. They were ready. So were the Thorne brothers. Holden had circled back through the kitchen's rear door without a sound, and he stood now in the inner doorway, the long sharp's rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm, the muzzle pointing nowhere in particular, and yet somehow exactly between the two strangers. Holden's face was as quiet and unreadable as a closed book. Cornelius's eyes found Della. The smile widened. "My dear child," he said, "I have been so worried. The whole family has been beside itself. Come along now, gather your things. We have a stage to catch back to Cheyenne." Della did not stand. She did not unfold her hands. She did not lower her chin. "I have no family, Mr. Whitcomb," she said. "My family was my father, and he is dead. You are not my family. You never were." Cornelius's smile flickered. He recovered it. "Now, my dear, the will of your late father plainly names me as your guardian until your 25th birthday. I have the document right here. We have been over this." He drew a folded document from the inner pocket of his vest. He laid it on the table. He smoothed it flat with one careful palm. Jasper Thorne stepped forward. He picked up the document. He did not unfold it yet. "Mr. Whitcomb," he said, "before we look at this paper, I would like you to know something. Miss Whitcomb has been in my household for 3 weeks. In that time she has told me in detail about her father, the Reverend Nathaniel Whitcomb, about the years of correspondence between her father and his lawyer in Boston, Mr. Edmund Ashby, about the contents of her father's will as filed with the probate court of Suffolk County, Massachusetts in May of this year, about the loop of the W in her father's signature, which she signed for him with his permission during the last year of his illness, perhaps 400 times. She knows her father's signature better than her own, sir. She knows a forgery when she sees one." Cornelius's smile did not move, but his eyes did. They flicked very briefly to the deputy. Jasper opened the document. He read it slowly in the warm, quiet cabin with the fire crackling on the hearth and the wind moaning around the eaves. He did not speak as he read. He read it twice. He folded it. He laid it back down on the table. His attention returned to Cornelius. "Mr. Whitcomb," he said, "this document was supposedly signed by the Reverend Nathaniel Whitcomb on the 17th of August, 1882. Is that correct?" "That is correct. It bears the seal of the probate court of Suffolk County." "It does. Mr. Whitcomb, the probate court of Suffolk County, Massachusetts, redesigned its official seal in 1881. The new seal carries the date of its issue and the words Sigillum Curiae Probatae around the perimeter. The seal on this document is the old seal, the one used before 1881. The cabin had gone very still. Furthermore, said Jasper, the loop of the W in this signature is too round, and the dot of the I is too high. Miss Whitcomb has told me that her father's hand shook so badly in his final 2 years that he could no longer dot the I above the line. He dotted it always level with the top of the letter. This is a child's signature, sir. It is not the signature of a dying minister with consumption. Cornelius's mouth opened. It closed. The deputy by the door shifted his weight. The other gunman, the heavier one, had taken his hand from the saddle horn and rested it now on the butt of his belt revolver. I will tell you, said Jasper, in the same level, unhurried voice, what I think happened. I think the Reverend Whitcomb died in May. I think you arrived at his daughter's boarding house 3 weeks later with a forged paper, hoping to bully a grieving young woman into a marriage that would have given you a brother-in-law named Pinkerton, who would have given you a piece of his hardware fortune in exchange for your delivery of an heiress. I think she refused you. I think she fled west. And then I think in October of this year, the Boston Globe printed the proposed route of the Boston and Albany spur line, and you saw with your own eyes that the spur runs straight through the $400 lot in Brookline that her father left her. I think that lot is now worth $7,000, $8,000, maybe more. I think you crossed half a continent in winter not because you love your niece. I think you crossed it because you cannot inherit through her if she is alive and married. And you cannot have her killed without giving the game away. So you came to take her back to Boston, to finish what you started. Cornelius's face had gone the color of paste. The deputy with the sun-colored mustaches turned his head and considered Cornelius for a long, slow moment. His attention moved to the document on the table, to Jasper, back to Cornelius. Mr. Whitcomb, said the deputy, the same voice he might have used to a man in a saloon who had bought him too cheap a whiskey. You told me back in Cheyenne. This paper was a court order from Massachusetts. You told me this lady had been kidnapped. That is what it is. That is what she was. The deputy shook his head slowly. That paper has the wrong seal on it, mister. I cannot read Latin, but I can read a date. 1882 on a seal that was retired in 1881 is a paper any judge in this territory would throw on the fire. His eyes turned to the heavier gunman. Bart, he said, we are leaving. Cornelius spun. Now, gentlemen, wait. I can pay you double. I can pay you triple. There is more money in this than I told you. I will give you each $500 in gold the moment we have her back to Cheyenne. Bart, the heavier man, took his hand off his pistol butt. He took off his hat. He scratched the back of his head. Mister, he said, I have been hired by some bad men in my life. I have been paid to do some things I will answer for someday. But I have not yet been paid to lay hands on a respectable woman in another man's home over a forged paper. I am not about to start at my age. The deputy is right. We are leaving. The two men turned. They stepped back through the door. They did not look at Cornelius again. Della heard them collect their long rifles from Caleb on the porch. She heard their boots on the steps. She heard them mount up. She heard the soft jingle of the harness as they turned their horses. Cornelius Whitcomb stood alone in the cabin of the Thorne brothers. His face had passed from paste white into a yellow-gray that was the color of a very old fish. His gaze darted from Jasper to Holden in the kitchen doorway to Della at the table. He took one step back toward the door. He stopped. He swallowed. The little man's hand twitched toward his coat. Jasper Thorne moved before the hand had completed its motion. He did not draw his rifle. He did not need to. He simply crossed the floor in 2 long strides and closed his enormous scarred hand around Cornelius Whitcomb's wrist, just below the cuff of his coat, and he turned that wrist slowly, with the patient, quiet pressure of a man closing a vise, until Cornelius Whitcomb made a small whimpering sound, and his fingers opened, and a 4-shot pepper-box Derringer fell out of his sleeve and clattered onto the floor. Holden picked it up without comment. Jasper let go of the wrist. "Mr. Whitcomb," he said, in the same level voice he had used the entire morning, "you are going to leave my mountain now. You are going to ride down to Pine Ridge with the deputy and his man. You are going to wire your lawyer in Boston by sundown today, and you are going to inform him that you withdraw any and all claim to the estate of the Reverend Nathaniel Whitcomb. You are going to send a copy of that wire to Mr. Edmund Ashby on Court Street. And then you are going to get on the next train east, and you are going to disappear from the lives of every soul in this room forever. Because if I ever hear your name spoken on this mountain again, Mr. Whitcomb, you will not see me coming, and neither will my brothers. Do you understand me?" Cornelius Whitcomb made a sound like a small animal being lifted by the scruff. He nodded fast. "Then go," said Jasper. Cornelius turned. He stumbled out the door. He missed the bottom step of the porch and went down on one knee in the snow and got up and ran for his horse. The deputy with the sun-colored mustaches sat on his own mount and watched him with an expression of weary disgust. Then the 3 of them turned and rode back down the mountain track without a backward look, and the wind rose, and the snow began to come hard again, and the column of riders disappeared into the white within 5 minutes. The cabin was silent. Granny Maeve at the table let out a long, slow breath. Caleb came in from the porch, stamping snow off his boots. Holden lowered the Sharp's rifle and leaned it against the wall. No one spoke. The fire on the hearth popped once. Della sat at the table. Her hands were still folded in front of her. She had not moved since Cornelius walked through the door. She tried to unfold her hands now. She found that she could not. She found that she was shaking. Jasper Thorne crossed the room. He did not say anything. He simply pulled the chair beside hers out from under the table and sat down in it close enough that his shoulder pressed warm against her shoulder, and he reached over and laid one of his work-hardened hands flat over her 2 clenched ones. He left it there. Slowly, very slowly, her hands began to stop shaking. Granny Maeve rose without a word and went to the kettle on the hearth and began to make tea. Caleb went out to the barn. Holden went up the stairs to clean his rifle. They left Della and Jasper at the table alone. After a long time, Della spoke. She did not look at him. "I have been afraid of him," she said, "for 7 months. I know. I dreamed about him. I dreamed he was at the door of my boarding house. I dreamed he was on the train. I dreamed he was here in this cabin, sitting at this very table. I know." She turned her head. She looked at him. "You knew everything he was going to say," she said. "Before he said it. You knew his paper was forged. You knew about the railroad spur. You knew about Mr. Ashby on Court Street. How?" He almost smiled. It was the second time she had seen him almost smile. "Holden took the wagon down to Pine Ridge yesterday," he said. "He sent a wire from the telegraph office at the depot to Mr. Edmund Ashby of Court Street, Boston, on the through line by way of Cheyenne. We had the answer back by sundown. Mr. Ashby was very glad to know you were alive, Miss Whitcomb. He had been searching for you since June. He had filed a missing persons inquiry with the Pinkerton Agency. He has been holding the proceeds of your father's estate in trust. The lot in Brookline sold to the Boston and Albany Railroad on the 14th of November of this year." He paused. "For $7,400. Della stared at him. "Mr. Ashby is wiring a draft to the Cheyenne National Bank in your name as we speak," said Jasper. "He needs your signature in person to release it. You will need to ride to Cheyenne in the spring, but it is yours, Miss Whitcomb. All of it. Your father left you well provided for. You are not a poor woman. You never were." Her vision had blurred. "Why," she said, "why did you not tell me?" "Because we did not know if Cornelius would come," said Jasper. "And if he came, we did not know whether he would come with the law or with guns. And I did not want you to spend 3 days afraid of a thing that might not happen. And if it did happen—" He stopped. His attention shifted to the fire. "If it did happen," he said, "I wanted it to be over before you knew it had begun." Della began to weep. She did not weep loudly. She wept in the quiet way of a woman who has been holding something a long time and only now is putting it down. Jasper did not move his hand from over hers. He did not speak. He let her weep. After a long while she stopped, and she dried her face on her sleeve, and she looked at him. The blizzard came that night. It came not as the storm of 3 weeks before, the storm of the Christmas Eve, when she had ridden up the mountain in the bare fur coat. That had been a hard storm, but a clean one. The storm that came on the night Cornelius Whitcomb fled down the mountain track was a different kind of weather. It came down out of the high pass to the north, where the cold air lived, and it brought with it a wind that stripped the bark off the young aspens and a temperature that fell by midnight to 38 below zero. The cabin shook in the wind. The windows iced over from the inside. The fire in the great hearth had to be fed every 20 minutes through the dark hours. By 2 in the morning the snow had begun to pile against the north wall of the cabin in a drift higher than a man's head, and the weight of the snow on the steep roof had begun to make the great pine ridge beam, the one Jasper's father had hewn from a single fir tree 40 years before, groan in a way none of them had heard it groan in any storm since. Jasper went up onto the roof at 3 in the morning with a snow shovel. He did not tell Della he was going. She woke an hour later to find Granny Maeve sitting by the fire alone, and she heard faintly through the howling wind the sound of a shovel scraping on cedar shingles directly above her head. She came down the stairs in her nightdress and her shawl. "How long has he been up there?" she asked. "An hour," said Granny Maeve. "Where are Holden and Caleb?" "The barn. Caleb fell on the woodpile at sundown and broke his ankle. Holden is splinting it. The barn roof is older than this one. They cannot leave it." Della stood at the foot of the stairs. She thought about Jasper Thorne alone on a steep cedar roof in a 38 below blizzard in the dark, shoveling tons of snow off a beam that might break under him at any minute. She thought about the look in his amber eyes when he had laid his hand over hers at the table. She thought about a young man named Jasper Thorne 10 years before pounding on the door of a doctor who would not open it. She turned. She went up the stairs. She came down again 3 minutes later in her wool dress, her boots, her gloves, and the heavy gray coat Jasper had bought her at Hiram Gable's store. Granny Maeve looked up. "Child, I am going to keep the fire fed and the kettle full," said Della, "and when he comes down off that roof, I am going to be the one to bring him in, because that is what a wife does, Granny Maeve. And I have been one in this house for 3 weeks. He has not asked me yet. I am not waiting any longer." Granny Maeve regarded her for a long moment. The old amber eyes glistened. "Then go, child," the old woman said. The shovel above stopped suddenly at 3:30. Della stood at the kitchen window with the lantern in her hand. She listened. She did not hear the ladder being descended. She did not hear footsteps. She heard the wind. She heard the wind. She heard the wind. Then faintly, the heavy, wrong sound of a body striking wood. A thud, muffled by snow, close to the back of the cabin where the woodshed leaned against the wall. Not the sound of a man stepping down. The sound of a man falling. She did not scream. She did not call for Holden in the barn. There was no time. She put on the bare fur coat that hung by the door, the one that swallowed her whole, and she took the lantern and she pushed out into the storm. The cold was a living thing. It struck her face like an open hand and stole her breath. The wind drove the snow horizontal across the yard so that the lantern light reached only a few feet before the white swallowed it. She held the lantern up. She pushed forward, hand on the cabin wall to keep her bearing, and she came around the corner to the woodshed. He was lying on his side in the drift at the foot of the ladder. He had fallen the last 6 rungs. His shovel lay an arm's length from his hand. The snow around him had gone pink in one small place where the side of his head had struck the corner of the chopping block as he came down, and a thin line of blood was running from his temple into the dark of his beard. His amber eyes were open. They were not focused. He was conscious, but barely. Della. She knelt. She got her shoulder under his arm. He was twice her weight. She would never in the warm reckoning of an ordinary morning have been able to lift him. But the cold takes a person past the ordinary, and so does love, and Della Whitcomb of Boston, who had once played Chopin nocturnes for the Pendletons on Beacon Hill, hauled Jasper Thorne up out of the drift, 1 terrible inch at a time. "Holden," she shouted into the storm, "Holden the barn." The barn door cracked open across the yard. A lantern came out at a run. Between them, Holden and Della got Jasper across the yard and up the porch step and through the cabin door. They laid him on the rag rug in front of the hearth. Granny Maeve was already there, the old woman quick as a girl in the emergency, kneeling with a cloth and a basin of warm water. Caleb came through the door behind them on a crutch fashioned from a broomstick, his splinted ankle dragging his face white. "He fell," Della said, "from the ladder. He hit his head on the chopping block." Holden tore open the front of his brother's coat. His hands moved fast and certain on the buttons of the wool shirt. The skin of Jasper's chest was the dangerous waxy pale of a man who had been on a roof too long, and the side of his head, where the wood had taken him, was already beginning to swell into a dark bruise the size of a closed fist. His breathing was shallow. His pulse, when Della pressed her fingers to the side of his throat, was slow and weak. "Frostbite on the hands," Holden said. "Bad on the right one. 2 fingers will blister. The rest will save." But Della, the blow on his head, she knew. She had read enough of her father's medical books in the long year of his sickness to know what a blow like that could mean. Concussion, bleeding inside the skull, fever to follow. A man could die from such a wound 4 days later when everyone thought he was mending. Tonight she said they would not lose him to the cold. That was what she could do. She worked through what was left of the night and through the gray dawn that followed. She stripped him of his frozen clothes and wrapped him in his mother's wool blankets that had come down from the cedar chest in Granny Maeve's room. She set warm cloths to his hands until the blue of the skin gave way to the angry red of returning blood, and he gasped in his half-conscious state at the agony of the thaw. She cleaned the cut at his temple with whiskey from the small bottle Holden kept for snakebite, and she stitched it closed with a curved needle and silk thread from Mary Thorne's sewing box. 3 small, careful stitches, the way her own mother had once stitched a cut on her father's hand when Della was 8 years old. She fed the fire. She brewed willow bark tea against the fever she knew was coming. She sat at his side on the rug with his enormous heavy head pillowed in her lap, and she did not move for 6 hours. The fever came at noon. It rose fast. By 2 in the afternoon, his skin under her hand was burning, and he had begun to mutter under his breath fragments of names she did not know, names of men long dead in his life. The name Eleanor once, and once, very softly, the name Della. By dark, his fever had crossed into the country where men do not always come back from. 104. 105. Holden by the hearth regarded her with stricken eyes. Caleb sat in the corner with his splinted leg propped on a chair, his hands clenched in his lap, useless and knowing it. Granny Maeve on the other side of the fire prayed without moving her lips, the way old women pray when there are no more words for it. Della rose from the rug. She dried her hands on her apron. "The wood," she said. "We are running low. I counted 8 logs. That will take us through tonight and not through tomorrow. Holden, you cannot leave Caleb alone in the barn, and Caleb cannot stand. I will go." "Della, I will go," she said. "I have watched Jasper split wood for 3 weeks. I know how the axe is held. I have my hands, and I have his coat, and I have the splitting block. I will go now." She did not wait to be argued with. She went out into the yard at 4 in the afternoon in the gray, waning light of the storm's second day, with the wind still tearing across the slope, and she set a round of pine on the chopping block, and she lifted Jasper Thorne's heavy splitting axe in her 2 small hands. The first swing went wide, and the axe head buried itself in the snow. She pulled it free. She lifted again. The second swing struck the log a glancing blow, and the round rolled off the block. The third swing she planted with her whole weight behind it, the way she had watched him do it 100 times, and the log split along its grain with a clean, sharp crack. Her hands began to bleed inside her gloves before the 5th log. By the 10th, her shoulders had passed pain into a hot, numb burn that ran from her neck to her wrists. By the 15th, the wind had stopped feeling cold to her, which she knew in the small, clear part of her mind that had read her father's books was a warning sign of its own. She kept on. The light failed. Holden came out at full dark with a lantern and would not let her swing again. He carried the split rounds to the porch in armfuls. She had cut in 3 hours, almost a full day's wood for a man twice her size. Inside, she peeled the bloodied gloves off her hands. The blisters had burst on both palms. Granny Maeve cleaned them soundless and bound them in clean linen and gave her hot tea and put her back on the rug at Jasper's side without a word. The fever broke at the hour before dawn. Della had not slept in 2 nights. Her head had drifted down against his shoulder, and she did not realize when his hand moved beneath the blanket that he had moved it himself. She did not realize until the rough, warm, scarred fingers found her bandaged hand and closed gently around it that he was awake. "Della." She opened her eyes. His amber eyes were clear. They were tired. They were fevered still, but the dangerous heat had broken. There was a faint sheen of healthy sweat on his brow. He was looking at her in the firelight, as if he had been looking at her a long while before she woke. "I am here," she said. "I dreamed you were splitting wood." "I was." His brow furrowed faintly. His eyes traveled to the bandages on her hands. They closed for one long moment. "How long?" 2 days, she said. The fever broke an hour ago. The swelling on your head is going down. Holden says the frostbite on your hands will cost you 2 blisters but no fingers. Granny Maeve says you have the constitution of an ox and will be on your feet in a week." He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth turned up and held there, and his hand tightened weakly on hers. "You kept the fire," he said. "I kept the fire." He drew breath. He let it out. The amber eyes were no longer guarded. They had stopped being guarded somewhere on the roof in the dark, perhaps, or somewhere on the chopping block where she had bled into her gloves to keep him alive, or perhaps somewhere on Christmas Eve in Hiram Gable's general store. She would never know exactly when. "Adelaide Whitcomb," he said. His voice was hoarse from the fever and rough with something else. "I am 34 years old. I am not a young man with pretty words. I have been alone on this mountain for 10 years. I had stopped expecting to live a different life. I had made my peace with that." He stopped. He drew breath again. "I have nothing to offer you that the world would call much. A cabin, a piece of land, 2 brothers and a grandmother who already love you, a hard winter every year for the rest of our days. But I will tell you what I do offer. I will keep my word to you every day of my life. I will not ever, so help me, God, close a curtain on you when you stand in the snow at my door. I will be your husband if you will have me. And if you will not have me, I will still be the man who carried your bags up this mountain on Christmas Eve, and that will be enough. Will you have me, Della?" Della did not weep this time. She had wept enough that month. She lifted her bandaged hand from his and laid it gently against his fevered cheek. "Yes, Jasper Thorne," she said. "I will have you. I have been having you since the moment you put that bear coat on my shoulders." He closed his eyes for one long moment. When he opened them, there was a tear at the corner of his right eye. He did not wipe it away. He brought her hand to his cracked lips and kissed the bandaged palm once in a way that was both a thank you and a vow. The wind howled, the fire burned, the cabin held. By morning the blizzard had passed. By noon, Jasper sat up against a heap of pillows by the hearth and drank slowly a bowl of broth Della spooned to him. By evening, Caleb's splint was holding well, and Holden had cleared the path to the barn, and Granny Maeve had taken to her chair with her knitting and a small private smile that she did not bother to hide. The Pine Ridge beam had held. The roof had held. The barn had held. They had all held. A week passed before Jasper could rise from the chair without help. 2 weeks before he could walk out to the woodpile and lift the axe. He did not lift it long the first day. He stood looking at the chopping block at the dark spot in the wood, where his blood had dried, at the pale spot beside it where Della's hands had bled too. Then he set the axe down. He came back inside. He took her bandaged hand in both of his and held it in front of the fire, and he did not say anything at all. In the second week of February, when the trail down the mountain had been broken open again by the regular passage of Holden's wagon to the snare lines, Jasper and Della rode down to Pine Ridge for the first time. Della did not return as the girl who had walked into Hiram Gable's store on Christmas Eve. She wore the heavy gray wool coat Jasper had bought her at that store. She wore Mary Thorne's fur-lined leather gloves. Her boots fit. Her hair was pinned up neat under a small dark hat Granny Maeve had pressed and trimmed for her with a fresh ribbon. The cameo lay at her throat. On her left hand, on the third finger, sat a small plain band of beaten silver that Caleb Thorne had hammered out of a $50 coin in the forge behind the cabin and slid onto her finger one quiet evening with his brother watching from across the room. She and Jasper had not yet stood before a preacher, but she rode into Pine Ridge as the affianced wife of Jasper Thorne, and she held her head up the way her father had taught her to, and she did not look right or left. The town had been waiting for her. Word in a place the size of Pine Ridge traveled on the wind. The deputy from Cheyenne had stopped at the saloon on his way back to the train 3 nights running and had told the story of what had happened at the Thorne cabin to anyone who bought him a drink. By the time Della and Jasper rode down the main street side by side on the buckboard on a clear, cold Wednesday morning in February, every shop on Front Street had a face at the window. Hiram Gable was sweeping the boardwalk in front of his general store when they pulled up. He stopped sweeping. He held the broom in both hands like a man who has forgotten what to do with it. His thick red face had gone pale in the cold, but it had also gone something else, something Della recognized after a moment as shame. He did not meet her eye. He looked at the boardwalk. Jasper set the brake on the buckboard. He came around to her side and lifted her down. He did not let go of her hand. They walked across the boardwalk together. Hiram Gable took 1 step back to let them pass, and he opened his mouth and he closed it. "Mr. Gable," said Della. He looked up. "Miss Whitcomb, Mrs. Thorne, or will be Mrs. Thorne. I have come to settle a debt," said Della. "The man at my side paid you for a bag of cornmeal and other goods on Christmas Eve. He paid you, in fact, far more than the goods were worth. He told you what the rest was for. You may remember." Hiram Gable's eyes had filled. He nodded. "I do remember, ma'am." "Then I have come to see if you have kept the bargain," she said. "I have come to see whether the next woman to walk into your store on a cold night and ask you for a sack of cornmeal has been treated kindly or whether she has been laughed at." The shopkeeper's chin trembled. He set down the broom. He put one heavy hand against the door frame to steady himself. "Mrs. Smollett," he said, 2 weeks ago. Husband died in the fall, 4 children. I gave her the bag of cornmeal. I gave her a side of bacon and a tin of peaches. I did not write it in the book. I have not laughed at a soul in this store since the night you walked through that door, Miss Whitcomb. Mrs. Thorne, I have not. Ask anyone." "I will not ask anyone," said Della. "I will take your word, Mr. Gable. A man can change. My father preached that every Sunday of his life." She looked at him. He met her eye for the first time. "Thank you," she said. He could not answer. He nodded. A tear ran into the corner of his mouth, and he did not wipe it away, and Jasper Thorne beside her lifted his hat 1 inch in acknowledgement of the man, and they went past him into the warm, bright store. The bell on the door rang. It was a different sound this time. The wedding was in May, when the windflowers were out. The Pine Ridge Congregational Church had not held so many people in its small wooden walls in the memory of any man living. Half the territory came. The deputy from Cheyenne came in a clean shirt with his sun-colored mustaches trimmed for the occasion. Mrs. Eunice Pemberton came from her boarding house weeping into a lace handkerchief, and behind her, her niece Hannah, a quick, sharp-eyed girl of 22, who would 3 years from this morning marry Caleb Thorne in this same church under the same yellow May sun. Pete Sutter. The blacksmith came, his cough mended on the arm of the bride, and he gave her away with a steadiness in his voice he had not had on Christmas Eve. Mrs. Calloway came in a new bonnet without peacock feathers. The Whitfield boy came. He was 15 now, and he had grown 2 inches over the winter, and he did not laugh. He cried a little in the 3rd row, and his mother did not scold him for it. Hiram Gable sat in the third row in a clean white shirt and a black wool coat, and he wept openly through the entire ceremony. Della wore navy blue. She would not wear white. She had chosen the same color she had worn into Hiram Gable's store on Christmas Eve, because that was the color of the woman Jasper Thorne had asked to marry, and she would not pretend otherwise. The dress had been remade for her by Mrs. Pemberton from a bolt of fine lawn silk Caleb had bought her in Cheyenne the week before. The lace at the collar was Mary Thorne's, taken from a wedding dress that had hung in the cedar chest for 30 years and would not have been worn again otherwise. The cameo brooch was at her throat. Her hair was pinned up in a low knot. She carried windflowers, mountain laurel, and a single sprig of pine. Jasper waited at the altar with Holden at his side and Caleb beside Holden. The three Thorne brothers in dark coats and white shirts and clean boots, all three of them too large for the small church, all three of them watching the door at the back as if they were not certain even now that the woman they had brought down off the mountain was real. Granny Maeve sat in the front pew. She did not weep. She wore an old shawl of black wool that had been her mother's in the Highlands of Scotland, and she watched Della come down the aisle on Pete Sutter's arm with an expression of such fierce, satisfied joy that the Reverend Whitfield, who had married many couples in his 30 years, would say afterward that the look on Granny Maeve's face had been worth the whole ceremony to see. The vows were brief. They were old. They were the same vows that have been spoken between men and women in plain frontier churches since the first plain frontier churches were built, and they did not need any new words to carry their weight. "Will you have this woman?" the Reverend Whitfield asked. "I will," said Jasper Thorne. "Will you have this man?" "I will," said Della Whitcomb. "You are home now," Jasper said quietly, when he leaned to kiss her the words for her, alone in the small public moment, and she smiled against his mouth and answered in the same quiet right where I am supposed to be. He kissed her, once, a long quiet kiss in the warm yellow May sunlight that came through the small east window of the Pine Ridge Congregational Church, and Granny Maeve in the front pew finally allowed one tear to roll down the side of her face. That night, Jasper Thorne carried his wife across the threshold of the cabin he had built into the side of the granite cliff above Wind River, and the door closed behind them, and the mountain held them both, and the long winter that had brought them together came finally, after many months, to its end. In the spring of 1886, on a morning in early March, when the snow was just beginning to give way on the lower slopes, Della Whitcomb Thorne was delivered of a daughter. The labor was hard. It was long. Granny Maeve and Mrs. Pemberton, who had come up the mountain 4 days earlier and stayed, kept Jasper out of the upstairs room for 16 hours. He paced the long plank floor of the great room until his boots had worn a track in the rag rug, and Holden and Caleb, who had been turned out onto the porch by Granny Maeve early in the morning, sat on the woodpile and drank coffee and did not speak. When the first thin cry of a newborn child finally came through the floorboards, Jasper Thorne, who had once stood unmoving while 2 paid gunmen broke their hands off their pistols in his cabin, sat down on the bottom step of his own staircase and wept into his hands. The girl was strong. She had Della's hair the color of honey in afternoon light and Jasper's amber eyes. They named her Eleanor Mary Thorne, after 2 women who had loved them, after 2 women they would not forget. Granny Maeve lived to hold her great-granddaughter. She lived another 6 years after that. She died, as Jasper had once seen and not yet spoken aloud, in the bed at the top of the stairs on a quiet morning in May, with the windflowers blooming on the slope. She was 91. Her last words were in Gaelic, and only Della, who had learned a little of the old tongue from her in the long evenings by the fire, understood what she said. She said, "The boy is breathing now. Tell him I am glad." In the autumn of 1888, Caleb Thorne married Hannah Pemberton in the same small church where his brother had been married, and they built a cabin of their own a half-mile down the slope. And within 10 years, they had 3 children of their own, and a flourishing carpentry business whose handmade furniture was sold as far as Cheyenne, and once, to Caleb's quiet pride, all the way to Denver. Caleb's table and chairs would decades later be in 3 governors' mansions across the West. Holden Thorne did not marry until 1895. He had watched his brothers settle, and he had been content to be uncle to their children, and he had thought that was all the life he was meant for. Then a young widow named Charlotte Reeves came to Pine Ridge on a teaching contract, a quiet brown-haired woman of 29 with a quiet brown-haired boy of 7, and Holden, who had spoken to no woman outside his family in 15 years, walked into the schoolhouse one afternoon in April to mend a broken hinge on the door, and walked out again 2 hours later, having forgotten what he had come for. They were married the following spring. The boy Samuel took the Thorne name and grew up to become the first lawyer in Pine Ridge. In the fall of 1889, Della bore a son. They named him Nathaniel after her father, the minister whose books had taught her to read, and whose faith had carried her up a mountain in a stranger's bear coat on Christmas Eve. Nathaniel grew tall like his uncle Holden, and thoughtful like his grandfather Whitcomb, and he would, at the age of 19, leave the cabin to study law at the University of Michigan, and come home 6 years later with a degree and a young wife, and the intention of never living anywhere else. The cabin grew. Caleb added 2 rooms in the spring of 1890. Jasper added a 2nd-story bedroom in 1893. Della's library, which had begun as one wall of her father-in-law's books, expanded along the south wall, and then around the corner, and then up the staircase, until by 1900 there were nearly 2,000 volumes in the cabin of the Thorne brothers, and the school children of Pine Ridge made the 8-mile climb up the mountain on Saturday mornings to borrow them 2 at a time, and Della Thorne, schoolmistress of the Wind River circulating library, kept careful accounts in a leather ledger, and never in 30 years asked a child to pay a fine for a book returned late. Hiram Gable died in 1904 at the age of 67 of a stroke in the back room of his general store. His will was read at the small attorney's office above the bank. He left the store to his nephew, who promised in his uncle's name to extend credit to any woman who came in alone on a winter night. He left his pocket watch to Jasper Thorne. He left in a small sealed envelope marked Mrs. Thorne a single double eagle gold coin and a folded note that read, "Only, this is one of the coins your husband paid down on the counter that night. I have kept it ever since. I never spent it. I want you to have it back. I am sorry. H. Gable." Della read the note in the warm kitchen of the cabin. She kept the coin in the wooden chest at the foot of her bed for the rest of her life, and on the night before she died, almost 40 years later, she gave it to her granddaughter and told her where it had come from. Christmas Eve, 1914. 30 years to the night. The cabin of the Thorne brothers was warm and full and loud. The fire on the great hearth had been built up against the cold of a hard Wyoming December. Outside the front windows, snow fell soft and steady, the way it had fallen on a different night long ago, but quieter, almost gentle. Inside 3 generations of the family, Della Whitcomb had married into were gathered for the Christmas meal. Eleanor, Mary Thorne, 28 years old, married now to a young doctor in Cheyenne, sat at the long plank table with her husband and her 2 small children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3. The boy was named Jasper after his grandfather. The girl was named for her great-grandmother Mary, and she had Della's blue eyes. Nathaniel Thorne, 25, sat with his young wife at the other end of the table. They had been married 6 months. She was Boston-born, the daughter of one of Edmund Ashby's law partners. She had come west with him and had not yet stopped exclaiming over the size of the sky. Caleb and Hannah were there with their 3. Holden and Charlotte were there with theirs, and with Samuel, who was now 26, and engaged to a girl from Laramie. Mrs. Eunice Pemberton, 94 years old now, and unstoppable as ever, sat in the chair of honor by the fire with a shawl on her shoulders and one of the small great-nieces on her knee. The long table seated 22 that night. Pete Sutter, the blacksmith who had given the bride away in May of '85 and was now 84 years old and almost blind, sat at the corner of the table with a glass of cider Della had poured for him and a smile that did not leave his face. Reverend Whitfield, 90 years old and frail as a sparrow, had come up the mountain on Holden's wagon and now dozed in the rocking chair Caleb had built for him 15 years ago, his Bible open on his knees. Jasper Thorne, 64 years old, stood at the front window with a cup of coffee in his hand and watched the snow come down. His hair was white now, entirely white. It had begun to turn the year Eleanor Mary was born, and by the time Nathaniel was 10, it had gone the color of pewter, and now it was the color of the snow on the great firs outside. His amber eyes had not changed. His shoulders, broad and square as ever, had begun to bow a little. He moved slower now, and the right knee that had taken him through 50 winters on this mountain ached on a hard frost. But he stood straight at the window in the firelight, and he watched the snow fall, and he was a tall and quiet man in his own house and his own land. Della Thorne, 53 years old, came across the room with 2 cups of coffee in her hands. Her hair was still mostly the color of honey, though there were silver strands at her temples now, and a single bright streak of silver at the front. She wore a wool dress the color of dark navy, the color she had worn on Christmas Eve 30 years ago, and on her wedding day, the color she had worn often enough since that her grandchildren teased her for it. She was not the slight, starved girl who had walked into Hiram Gable's general store. She had filled out in the way of women who have lived well and been loved. She had grown into the deeper kind of beauty that a woman who has been seen and not turned away can grow into, and her amber-eyed husband, watching her now from the window with his coffee cup forgotten in his hand, had not stopped looking at her with the same look he had given her by lamplight in his grandmother's sick room on a winter night in 1884. She handed him the second cup. "What are you thinking, my love?" she asked. He did not answer for a moment. He took a slow swallow of the coffee. The amber eyes gazed out across the snow. "I was thinking," he said, "of a girl who walked into my path on Christmas Eve 30 years ago, with 3 pennies in her hand, wearing boots that did not fit her, with the snow in her hair." Della smiled. She turned and stood beside him. Her shoulder, after 30 years, fit exactly under his arm, in the place she had long since claimed as her own. He let his arm settle across her shoulders. He drew her in. "I was thinking," he said, "of how I have never quite stopped expecting her to disappear. as if she was a thing my heart made up out of need, and the morning would come some day when I would wake and find an empty chair across from me. She laid her head against his shoulder. "I have not disappeared," she said. "No," he said, "you have not." Behind them, in the warm, full room, Caleb had taken down his fiddle from the peg above the fire and had begun very softly to play. His son Samuel produced a small tin whistle from his vest pocket and joined in. Hannah Thorne began to sing, her voice a clear, sweet alto, an old Scots ballad Mary Thorne had sung in this same room 50 years ago. Her grandchildren stopped their running and listened. Eleanor Mary picked up her 3-year-old daughter and rocked her slowly in the rhythm of the music, and the 3-year-old's eyes grew heavy and closed. The cabin held. The mountain held. The man at the window with his white hair and his amber eyes, who had once on a winter night ridden down to fetch his brother some liniment for his back, looked down at the woman in the navy blue dress who had walked into his life with 3 pennies in her fist, and he kissed the silver streak at her temple, and he said very quietly against her hair, "You are home now, Mrs. Thorne, right where you are supposed to be." Della Thorne, who had wept many times in her young life, and not many in her old one, did not weep now. She closed her eyes. She breathed in the smell of wood smoke and pine, and the coffee in her cup, the same 3 smells she had walked toward through the snow in 2 big borrowed boots 30 years ago, the smells that had meant home to her ever since. She still remembered stepping through the door of Hiram Gable's general store on Christmas Eve with 3 pennies in her closed fist and a torn dress, and no one in the world to call her by her name. 30 years later, in the warm cabin her husband had built with his own hands, with the firelight in his amber eyes, and her grown children at the long plank table behind her, and her grandchildren asleep on the rug at her feet, she thought, with a clarity as quiet and as certain as the snow falling outside the window, that was the night my real life began. The bell above the door of Hiram Gable's general store 15 miles down the mountain rang now and then in the years that followed for many other customers on many other ordinary days. But it had never rung again for Della Thorne. It did not need to. She had walked through her last door on Christmas Eve, 1884. The door had closed behind her, and what waited for her on the inside was every good thing she had ever in her hardest, darkest year dared to hope for. Outside, the snow kept falling, the fire kept burning, the fiddle kept playing, the mountain kept holding them, all of them, 3 generations under one warm roof on the longest night of the year, and the man at the window held his wife of 30 years against his side and watched the snow come down across the trees of Wind River, and he did not need to say what he was thinking because she already knew. She was home now, right where she was supposed to be.